Hello, everybody. We are recording and we are here today with Antone Haley. And he was a client of mine. We started working together back in, I think, early 2019, working on some nutrition for performance stuff, hydration. And my husband has known Antone for a while now. And he also taught me, I believe it's called an edged weapons class. Is that yeah, so we got some expert help with that. That was a several years ago now. All I remember is kind of like, I remember this thing. So
That's all you need.
Yeah, for those of you who are listening, it's just a hand kind of swiping motion that I remember from the class, but again, it was several years ago, so I could be doing it completely wrong. So I'm going to let Antone kind of introduce himself a little bit and dive into maybe what his sport is. It's going to be a little bit different than previous podcasts. For those of you guys listening in, we've done some interviews with like triathletes and endurance athletes. And I think Antone has a really unique background and type of training that he does. And I think this is going to be a really cool podcast for you guys to listen into. So Antone, why don't you let us know how you got into your sport and what that sport is?
Oh boy. So the genesis of kind of what I do is really based in martial arts, right? So I've been a martial artist, a serious martial artist since I was a teenager. I started when I was, very, very young. And I was kind of the guy that just never stopped and kept going. And, the long story short there, I think, is, as you're studying these kind of these older systems of combat, at some point you come to a head or a point where firearms get mixed into the bunch, and then you need to decide what you're going to pick up and what you're not going to pick up. So for me, I decided a long time ago that if you're going to pick something up, you got to pick up the whole thing. And for the last several hundred years, firearms have been a part of combatives. They really haven't, people try to create a separation there, but you really can't. They're interwoven. And so roughly about the time I was in college, I decided I was going to pick that up as well as kind of part of this journey that I was on. And I started shooting. And then time went on. I became a police officer. I'm a cop here in California in a large city. And I was looking for kind of a methodology of training, or how guys are staying sharp on the tactical side of the house, how the tactical athletes are doing what they do and doing it well. And through that process, I stumbled upon an event called the Tactical Games. It's pretty unique. In the shooting world, it's probably the most physically demanding event that exists currently. It's a 2-day event. There are at least 6 stages over those 2 days, and it's a combination of marksmanship and essentially physical tasks. So it'll be moving a sandbag or a farmer's carry, or there'll be a run, or there'll be a ruck march, or there'll be a rope climb, or et cetera, et cetera. And the stages can range from, a short stage with a few rounds and only 3 minutes to a 45-minute stage. You show up and you don't really know what you're going to be facing. The tasks are not released ahead of time. So, you need to put the work in and show up with I can do it attitude and, go for it.
Yeah. And so with the Tactical Games, for those of you who have never heard of it before, they host it throughout several different states, correct?
Yeah. So my first year competing was 2019. I think my first event was in Mississippi. I competed in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Atlanta.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And so one of the things Antone needed help with was, I think it was specifically Georgia, was really hot and humid. And so we worked on some hydration stuff there for him to help with that piece of it. But I think also with the circumstances of the environment, I remember you texting me at one point, and you were out in, I think, kind of sounded like the middle of nowhere, and couldn't get access to, or he ran out of his powdered carbohydrate source that we had referred to him, that was kind of a portable carb source to use in between these events, and he ran out. And so we had him go to I don't even know where, but grab some maple syrup, I think is what we ended up doing, was kind of the resort, the last resort there. And how did the maple syrup swap work for you?
So I've had to do that twice, because typically when I go to a match, I have bags that are set up with numbers on them,
Mm,
and it's what I'm going to consume right before the match and then right after the match.
awesome.
And everything's measured out. So I just pull out the bag, I throw it in the shaker, and all I need to do is pay attention to the clock so I can get the timing right.
Mm.
And I think it happened twice where something was off, or something didn't make it in the bag, or the measuring was wrong, and I was stuck without the carbohydrates. Which, if you're, I mean, it was 100 plus at 80% humidity at both those events where it happened, and so your hydration and my carbohydrate intake was crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember making that call. I called your husband, and then your husband was like, "Oh, we gotta get the wife in on this."
Yeah.
And you told me maple syrup. So I said, okay. And so I remember laughing hysterically, thinking of you in 110-degree heat at 80% humidity, drinking maple syrup out of the bottle, uh, prior to stepping on the field.
Yeah.
But, both those events I came in first place. My stomach, I didn't have any issues with my stomach during the match. So
Awesome.
it's a little bit of magic, but it worked
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. So with that kind of in a pinch situation, like typically with the maple syrup stuff, I mean, obviously most people with maple syrup are adding it to something else or diluting it one way or another, as opposed to drinking it straight out of the jar or however it's coming to you.
So, fun fact, when maple syrup sits in a trunk and it's 100 degrees out, it's pretty liquified. So, it goes down real easy.
Smooth. Well, that's good
I
to
don't know,
know.
smooth, but easy.
That's good. And I'm glad. So with the tactical game stuff too, your first competition, there's kind of different tiers, right? So or different divisions, I think, right? And so the first competition, what was the name of the division that you competed in your first time?
So, for the games, for men's, there's an intermediate division, there's an elite division, and then there's a division for people that are 40 and over, and then
Mm,
there's one women's division.
okay.
So when I went in Mississippi, I really didn't know where I stood with any of this. I didn't know anything about it.
Hmm.
So I went in the intermediate, and I ended up first place in that. And so the subsequent three matches I entered as an elite competitor, which was kind of the top rung, so to speak.
Awesome. And you podiumed or took first in all three or both elite divisions as well, you're saying too, once you got.
Yeah, so I went four events. The first event in Mississippi was intermediate, and I won that. The three successive events, I was in Atlanta and then North Carolina and South Carolina as an elite competitor. I
Awesome.
was first place in those three matches. And then because I had won um, North and South Carolina, it was like a cup series,
Mm,
and whoever had the most points over those two events won what was called the Carolina Cup. It was kind of like a specialty award,
hmm.
and so I ended up winning that as well.
Well, I didn't know about that one. That's
Yeah,
awesome. Very
yeah, it's pretty
cool.
cool.
So kind of to touch back a little bit on the nutrition piece of it and talking about hydration, what did you end up using for your hydration? Do you remember for Georgia?
I used whatever you told me to use, and it worked great.
Awesome. And I had in my notes too from our call, we had done some discussion about, I think like your analysis test strip testing. Did you end up ever using that?
I haven't gotten there yet. I think, well, I just when when we talked, one of the things I was so taken back by was like how much there was to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, well, what should I eat? Well, it seems like a really simple question, but it's not, right? It's
Yeah.
okay, well, how old are you? Or what kind of shape are you? And what are you
Yeah.
preparing for?
Right.
And it goes all the way down to, what did you do the last hour and what are you going to do the next hour?
Yeah.
So there's so much that goes into it. So, all the information you gave me and then the programming that you wrote out for me, I'm still a year later putting pieces of that together
Yeah.
to try to get my performance as optimal as I can.
Yeah.
And it's uh, it's easier to do it a piece at a time because then it sticks and I stay with it.
Yeah.
And it's also fun to like see the incremental changes. Like I
Hmm.
remember when training wise, when we made the alterations to hydration and then what I was doing pre workout for
Hmm.
fueling, it made a huge difference in what I was able to do at practice. And so
Awesome.
I entered into this real weird space that I've been able to keep, where I was completely exhausted. I didn't feel like my body worked anymore, but I could somehow keep going and do the work I needed to do. It's a very
Yeah.
strange feeling,
Yeah.
but it's kind of where I'm at, and it's
Awesome.
because of the stuff I put in.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And I think you're totally right on with a lot of that stuff. Is like when I design a plan for a client, I think a lot of times they get really excited and they want a lot of all the information, but then yeah, you look at all this information and there are so many pieces to it that when you kind of step back and take one piece at a time, you're able to actually turn that into a habit really, and make it a bit more of a consistent pattern than kind of like an example is like people who dive right into diets all of a sudden, and it's like a lot of stuff and they try and go all in, and then it's like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of work, and then kind of back away from it and let it go, and then end up kind of cycling back or losing that habit. So I think, or losing any of that kind of motivation to keep doing it too. And so taking it piece by piece, I think, is a big important part of it. And you're saying like even a year later, you're pulling little nuggets out of it to kind of keep implementing, which I think is awesome. And so, yeah, one thing at a time, I think is kind of the best way to approach it for long term use too.
Yeah, well, I think it's a process, right? So figuring out what to eat and when to eat it and what not to eat. It's a process that gets developed just like whatever your physical training is, right? If you're lifting weights or if you're doing martial arts, those techniques are evolving, and so should your nutrition,
Yeah.
be evolving as well.
Definitely. And so with kind of on the nutrition note there, prior to us working together and you reaching out, what do you think? I mean, I know from my notes, obviously in our initial conversation, but what would you say was like your main reason for reaching out and getting nutrition help?
So honestly, like I never, like I looked at this next phase that I was trying to do is, athletically is a pretty major challenge. And I never thought of myself as that great of an athlete. And so I was like, well, I need every advantage I can possibly get here. And so the food was a major part of it. And then kind of with that sentiment, part of what I do is a huge grind. I mean, my training volume is pretty off the chart. It was off the chart when I was a competitive fighter. It's off the chart now as a competitive shooter. And so, looking at all the things I need to do and all the things I need to be fueled for, being able to do those things safely, I guess, was a big factor in trying to getting the right food right.
Yeah.
Because like when I was a competitive fighter, I think that when you look at it from the outside, okay, well, you just got to go to practice, and well, that's true. But we have boxing practice, we have kickboxing practice. There's clinch work that needs to be done. There's wrestling. There's MMA specific material, and then there's grappling. And then within each of those subsets, there are further subsets, right? So with my grappling, I need to work off my back. I need to work my guard passing. I need to work my submission skills. I need to work my escapes. I need to work my submission escapes. And so it's just you can't get by and be lazy, and you can't get by and do a little bit. Like I said earlier, you if you're going to pick something up, you got to pick the whole thing up. And the only way to do that is if you're fueled right.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. And so when I designed that kind of first plan for you, when you looked at it, this is a question I've been asking all of my previous interviews, is what was the thing you kind of looked at and saw in there and you're like, oh my gosh, like I have to do what? Did you have that moment?
So not really. I mean, the volume was pretty large, but I eat every 90 minutes as it is now. So it wasn't a huge change as far as that goes. I think the thing that's probably helped me more than anything was looking at carbohydrate intake. Like
Mm,
when I look at my macros, like I really was never eating enough carbohydrates to fuel what I was doing. And I
mhm.
think that um, it kind of gave way to a cycle of of training a lot and training really hard, and okay, now I'm exhausted and I need to take a period off. And okay,
Yeah.
now I'm good again. And so since just making that adjustment to my macros, right, I'm back, double and triple days, and I can push a lot further, a lot more consistently, because I know I have what I needed. But
Yeah.
when I first looked at the spreadsheet, I was like, what is this? This is more carbohydrates than I eat all week, and you're having me, before 12 o'clock, I'm eating this.
Yeah.
But you were right. So here we are.
Well, I'm glad that worked. And I should say that that's a common theme, is specifically the carbohydrates. I get that feedback from a lot of clients. And I would say too, like with your sport and your training, is you're doing a lot, like every sport you just mentioned is all intervals of high intensity, right? And then even the style of like, would you describe it as kind of CrossFit-ish style when you do your strength work stuff, or would you describe that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, no, I mean, I think that when I go to matches, this is kind of a segue, but when I go to matches, I think that one of the reasons I'm successful is that I show up having prepared for the event I'm about to do. And I think most of the other athletes, they they play a different game. They think they're in shape, which they are,
Mhm.
but they think they're in shape, and then they show up to the event and they're hoping that the fitness that they got from the game that they play is going to correspond. And you
Mm.
just mentioned CrossFit as an example. There's a ton of CrossFit guys that come out. There's people that have competed in the games, very high level people, and I think it's an error. I think
Mm.
it's an error to use something to prepare for something else. And
Mhm.
so a lot of the strength stuff I do is it's pretty sports specific. I may be in the weight room 2 days a week to try to get stronger,
Mhm.
but like as an example, one of the events we had to move a sandbag that was around 180 pounds or so, right? And
Wow.
if you couldn't pick that sandbag up, put it on your shoulder and jog with it, you weren't even in the running. You weren't going to be in the top 10 for that stage. And so that's one of those things where you can do a lot of deadlifts and you can do a lot of cleans and you can do a lot of whatever you want, but unless you're getting under that sandbag and you're practicing getting it on your shoulder and moving with it,
Right.
everything else is going to get lost in translation.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the ways I kind of look at the training, the preparation.
Yeah. I think, I mean, I think that's really smart. And I totally hear what you're saying there too with that. And I've seen, I think with CrossFit, a lot of people look at that too as a very, a varied type of training, right? But it does cover a lot of things, but like you're saying, it doesn't cover those specifics that you get to expose yourself to in the tactical game. So yeah, that makes sense. And so with kind of touching back to like the nutrition of that type of stuff, is lifting heavy stuff, 180-pound sandbag, and jogging with it for a distance. And are you dropping that and picking it back up and jogging back, or what would be the next step to that, you think? Or give us an example of like what one of your stages
So
is.
okay, an example of a stage. So everybody shows up with whatever they got, right? Whatever physicality they got and whatever skills they have. And so there will be different stages that crush different people and different stages where people excel.
Mhm.
And so one of the stages that I had a difficult time with was it was one of the Carolina events. I think it was in North Carolina. We had to pick up a sandbag. It was around, I think it was around 180 pounds. You put it on your shoulder, and we moved about 40 yards. Then there was a shooting array we had to shoot. Then we picked the bag back up and we moved it about 50 yards and dropped it off. And then we had maybe a half-mile run. We had a series of 8-foot walls we had to jump over. Then the half-mile run back, pick the sandbag back up, 50 yards, shoot the array, sandbag back up, take it back to the start, right? And then you were
Jeez.
done. So you got to pick that thing up 4 times and you're moving it, 200-ish yards right
Hmm.
over the course of that.
Yeah.
And the last time I had to pick that up, I just barely managed to get it on my shoulder. I was hooting and hollering and screaming while I was trying to get it back, right? And so when I got back, I bought a sandbag and I started to work that, because part of it is a skill, right? You got to, have a good kind of fixed core deadlift technique to get the thing to your hips. And then you got to figure out how to use your hips to explode it on your shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a tremendous amount of like unilateral core strength that you need to keep that thing on your body while you're moving.
Right.
So for me, that was one of the more difficult stages that I shot. You know, for the other guys, like there's a guy that competes who's an Olympic lifter, and he does strongman stuff.
Oh, wow.
So he picked that thing up with one arm and threw it on his back and ran with it. So everybody's got their strengths and weaknesses, but that was one thing that you know, it was also the first time I ever picked a sandbag up that was that heavy before,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not allowed to touch it before the match starts. So I didn't know how big or how heavy it was. They just said, "Yep, pick it up and move it."
Jeez.
So yeah, here we go. And you know, it worked out.
Yeah. And so, yeah, a lot of that stuff that you're doing, we would say that you're asking your body to go glycolytic, right? For these shorter distance, higher intensity, either lifts and runs or things like that. And by going glycolytic, that increases your reliance on carbohydrates within the muscle tissue. And so by making sure we are supplying you with enough of that stuff, I think that comes down to like, that just brings me back to the whole, that's a lot of carbs, right? And so that's part of the reason for that. And even with a lot of my endurance athletes, although they might be doing intervals during their training, but that longer steady state stuff too, we still see in the research that the carbohydrates are king in terms of performance, even in that kind of style of stuff as well. So it's a common theme, I think, in the you know, athlete world, is that if we're not utilizing enough carbohydrates or recovering with enough carbohydrates or consuming enough throughout the course of the day, we can kind of feel that bonking kind of sensation or kind of fatiguing out or heavy legs or things like that. So I'm glad that worked out for you. And so with the kind of back to the tactical game stuff, how many different stages did you say you'll have in a day?
So you'll have at least 3. There was one event where we had 3 stages the first day. The first day are usually the longer stages, and then the second day usually the shorter stages. But in that particular event, we had the end of the first day, 3 stages, and then they said all elite competitors need to be here 4 in the morning, ready to go. So we just said, oh, great. So you know, I'm coming from the West Coast, so it was like the time change was horrendous.
Right.
And we showed up and it was dark and we were all in the middle of a field, and there was a pile of 50 rucksacks, and you know, okay, we kind of knew what was coming, right?
Yeah.
And so we started that day off with a you know, a 5-mile ruck with, you know, 45 or 50 pounds, right?
Jeez.
So that was like that was one of the longer stages.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no shooting in that stage, it was just a movement, but you know, that all got computed into the scores, you know, at the end of the day.
Yeah. Wow. And so with the kind of looking at all the different stages you've done over the multiple tactical games, what would you say is your favorite piece of it?
So if I'm good at anything, it's moving like a moderate load over a pretty moderate distance. So if I have to, you know, move a sandbag 3 miles, you know, I can do that pretty quickly. And so that's kind of where I excel. The stages with longer runs, right, where it's like a mile plus in between your shooting, those are typically the stages I do really well in. And then you know, the shooting, I mean, I'm consistent. I'm not necessarily the best shooter on the field, but I'm really good at shooting under extreme duress, which is really what the tactical game is all about, right? After you know, you do something like when I was moving that sandbag, that was basically me moving at max effort, you know, 4 times, and then having to figure out how to slow my heart rate, my breathing down enough to get the hits I needed. Because every miss is 10 seconds. And so, you know, if you're on a shorter stage where it's only 3 minutes and you miss 3 rounds, that's 30 seconds on a 3-minute stage. That's an eternity. Same thing if, you know, if stage requires a mile run. If you drop 2 shots, 20 seconds, that's an eternity for somebody to catch up to you.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's definitely a balance of, you know, how hard you push and then what shots can you make.
Yeah. Yeah. And so with the setup of the stages, what kind of time windows were you having in terms of like to recover nutritionally between? Were you having like 30 minutes, a couple hours? Is it different all the time?
It's a couple hours because all the different divisions need to cycle through, the three stations.
Hmm.
And so you'll show up there in the morning, 7, 8 o'clock, whatever, and you'll kind of launch, and then there'll be a couple hours, and then you'll hit the second one, and then you'll get out of there in the late afternoon, your third stage.
Yeah.
And so it's an advantage in a lot of ways because I can really dial in hydration and nutrition in that time. I can get a lot of rest in that time. I think that there's very few sports you can play where you're going to be more dependent on your gear than the shooting sports, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it gives me time to square my gear away and make sure everything's working and
Yeah.
everything's where it needs to be and configured for the next stage and all that. So that's kind of how it goes.
Yeah. And how much would you say your gear weighs, or does that vary stage to stage?
So it's mandatory for elite men that their body armor is 16 pounds,
Okay.
and they weigh it prior to the match, and then they'll also spot check kind of people as they go just to make sure everybody's being honest. So you
Hmm.
have to have 16 pounds of gear on.
Wow.
You have to have a rifle. Your rifle is going to weigh probably at least 6 pounds.
Hmm.
A lot of guys build ultralight rifles
Oh,
for the
wow.
matches because they know they're going to be carrying them, right? So
Yeah.
a good example is like something on a on a rope climb. If my rifle weighs 5 pounds and somebody else's rifle weighs eight, that's an advantage that I have.
Hmm.
Particularly like if I just did a heavy farmer's carry for 100 yards and now I need to climb,
Yeah.
a rope 2 times. Every pound is going to count, and so
Yeah.
guys will make lightweight rifles. And then you'll need your handgun, and then whatever ammunition is required for the stage,
Hmm.
and then ear and eye protection, kind of safety equipment kind
Yeah.
of a deal. So you're probably looking at 30 pounds ish, plus or minus 5 pounds, depending on how lightweight the stuff you run.
Wow. Yeah. That adds that extra challenge in addition to your sandbag or whatever else they are having you carry there. So let's see. So with this kind of, we're in the midst of, for everyone listening, we're recording this in May 2020, and COVID is in full force. So did you have any races or competitions or anything like on the calendar this year before COVID kind of came to be, or?
Uh, Not necessarily. Like this year was, just because of personal stuff, this year was kind of going to be a slow start for me.
Mm-hmm.
This year they're doing a national championship in Florida in November.
Okay.
But in order to compete in the national championship, you have to qualify at a regional event. You have to finish in the top 5 or 10, right?
Oh, okay.
And so that was a goal of mine. I wanted to get out there, but then with COVID stuff, number one, like travel is shut down,
Yeah.
gatherings were shut down in all states for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and then work's been hectic as a police officer with all the changes in the schedules and new things we're doing with that.
Yeah.
So there's a match in South Carolina at the end of the month. And so I'm assessing if I can get out there, right, with
Mm-hmm.
COVID issues, with work issues, with personal issues.
Yeah.
I got to determine how safe I feel it is to fly.
Yeah.
And so probably, the beginning of next week will be roughly like 14 days out from that. And I'll make kind of a go, no go assessment as far as that
Yeah.
is.
Awesome. That's exciting. And so did they did they have to postpone the championships at all, or has it always been scheduled for end of the year?
No, it seems like most people's attitude is that we're on the back end of what's going on in terms of restrictions, right? That
Mm-hmm.
could obviously change at any moment.
Yeah.
They did have to move and postpone and cancel events earlier in the year just with what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had to guess, it's going to start to be business as usual, at least for the events I compete in, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. So we'll stay tuned to keep tabs on the success there. And how has your training changed, or has it changed at all since the COVID situation?
So, martial arts is kind of the base of everything I do. And so that is shut down at this point. All the martial art gyms are shut down. They will probably continue to be shut down for a while, and it's pretty much impossible to maintain social distancing and do martial arts. It's
Right.
not going to happen. Other than conditioning, it's very hard to train by yourself because you need another person to get better. It's just how it is. So that's been very much put on pause. As far as tactical game stuff, I'm lucky I have all the resources I need to basically train on my own. I've got all the equipment and I've got all the space I need to be successful. And that's been a big part of being successful in the sport, thus far, I guess.
Awesome.
And so I'm still training really hard. Um, after last year, one of my weaknesses was just kind of general strength. So actually, your husband helped me a lot with that and with programming and with movement coaching. And so I spent since last season trying to get stronger, and then the last month or two going back to that sport specific training to try to get all the techniques down and the tasks I got to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if anything, I've probably been training harder because I can't be in the martial arts gym, right?
Yeah. So you eat more carbs then?
So many carbs.
Awesome. And so can you share a day in the life of Antone in terms of like, what time do you wake up? What is your training? Maybe what do you eat for those interested? And of course, I'm curious too.
So because of what my schedule's like at work, everything goes in a big cycle,
Mm-hmm.
and so on a work day, I assume you don't want to hear about a boring day, right? Which would be a work day, which, I'll get up, I'll work out, I'll go to work. And then maybe if I get home in time, I'll work out, I'll do a light workout in the evening. I usually don't get home till 12:30 at night. So it's
Mm-hmm.
difficult to get that second workout in.
Yeah.
Psychologically, I like to have my days be at least double days.
Mm.
But like a heavy day for me, not yesterday, but the day before, I ended up getting up around 9. I usually eat really light, so I'll eat some fruit. One of
Mm-hmm.
the things my nutritionist taught me was that bananas and oranges were the two things I could get away with for fast burning carbs.
Yes.
So I typically will hydrate right away and eat some fruit, and then I make a shake with carbohydrate powder and electrolyte.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm drinking that. I usually drink about half of that prior to my workout. The other half gets drinking during.
Mm.
And so I was at the range that day. I try to focus on different things every time I'm out there, depending on, what my weaknesses are.
Mm-hmm.
So that day it was heavy farmer's carry. And so it was a 50-yard farmer's carry, followed by a 150-pound sandbag carry. It was probably another 50 yards up and over a hill and back down. And then a 50-yard run to a shooting station, 50-yard back to the farmer's carry, 50-yard farmer's carry, and then another shooting array. And then I would do that again. And so I did, the first one was 3 in a row, back to back like that. And then I did 2, rest, and then 2 other sets of 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm monitoring, what I'm doing strength wise, and then what my hit ratios are. Right. And so that was kind of my first workout of the day. Come back, I got to down all my gear, and then it's a protein shake with a bunch more carbohydrates because I just worked really hard. And then that's usually my first meal. And even though it's late, it's my breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
And so another thing my nutritionist taught me was that different types of protein are going to assimilate faster than others. And so I like eating my eggs after that workout. So I'll have a bunch of eggs and some more bread for more carbohydrates. And there's some avocado in there and some turkey, just a bunch of healthy stuff in a bowl pretty much.
Awesome.
And so I'll eat that, and then I'm usually resting or doing errands or doing whatever I need to do. And then I'll spin the whole thing back up again. So I'll eat another meal of fruit, another carbohydrate and electrolyte shake. And then that day I was in the weight room and I was doing heavy deadlifts and weighted pull-ups, and I forgot what my third lift was. But that's what I did there. And then it was the same cycle: go home, protein, carbohydrates, another meal, rest, and then I usually eat a snack. And then that night I went out on a ruck run. So it was 45 pounds for 3 miles.
Jeez.
And then I'm coming back, carbohydrates, protein, another meal, rest, and then another meal, and then bed.
Awesome. So a
So
lot of,
that is a like comically heavy day. I don't
yeah,
have a ton of those during the week.
yeah.
Um, but training will taper, and so like right now, my volume is incredibly high. I'm training all the time, and then next week it'll start to taper off. And then assuming I compete the next week, I'll have probably 3 or 4 days of full rest,
Mhm.
stepping into it. So the goal is that when you show up, everything feels light and goes really easy. That's
Right.
never the case, but that's always the goal.
Yes. And do you program your own training, or do you have someone programming?
I program it myself because number one, there aren't that, like, the sport's pretty new, and
Hmm.
there aren't a lot of people that um, are going to have their fingers on the pulse, I think, of the
Yeah.
sport well enough to really make good programming for it.
Hmm.
So that's one. Number two, I was really successful previously with the programming that I just made up in my head on the way to the range. So I'm going to, kind of keep that going.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that I constantly am criticized by my coaches, and rightfully so, for my training volume being too high.
Mm,
And as I say it, or as I put it on paper, I get it.
mm.
It's way too high. But now that I got the right food in me, that helps. And I've also been having that output forever since I've been a martial artist. I've been putting in way more work than anybody was supposed to.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think I have a good sense of what I can do and what I need to do to be successful. And so I just put it into action and I go.
Yeah. Awesome. And let's see, what would you say, just a little nutrition question, what's your favorite like meal on a training day? What does that look like? Is it the fruit you talked about, or what is your eggs, or?
Favorite meal? I like them all. I
Yeah, that's
honestly
good.
like, I there isn't anything I necessarily like more than anything else, because it's all like really super clean, healthy food. But more than what the food tastes like, I like the idea that I'm eating the right thing at the right time,
Yeah.
so that a few hours from now I can pack up and I can go not only do what I need to do, but keep expanding, in whatever realm that is, and keep getting better. And so I think, um, for me, that's the feeling. It's not necessarily what the meal is, but knowing that it's the right meal at the right time to accomplish whatever my goals are.
Yeah. That's great. I wish everyone could look at food that way. That's perfect. And so a kind of funny final question that Sid helped me with this one, my husband, is for you. What is the animal you think you could take down in the octagon? And we had a couple options for you to select from. So we have a
Okay.
kangaroo, a mountain
Okay.
lion, or a grizzly bear.
I think the obvious choice is the kangaroo.
And why?
I figure the kangaroo, he's only hands. That's all he's got, right? Kangaroo, he's going to box at
Yeah.
me. So I'm probably going to be able to maybe slip those punches, and maybe take him out at the legs and then
Yeah.
get on top of him. I mean, as I sit here, that's my plan. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'm going to go with the kangaroo.
All right. Awesome. Well, so that's kind of the end of our podcast here today, you guys, with Antone, and learning a lot about the tactical games and his type of training, how he fuels and supports that. And if you guys have any questions about our podcast, feel free to put them in the comment section. If you're watching this on YouTube, or you can always message us, or message nutritionalrevolution@gmail.com if you guys have any questions for Antone. All right. Thank you, Antone.
Absolutely. Thank
Take
you.
care.